Shadow! What is it, boy? Cal Rourke had just eased into the creaking wooden chair by the hearth when his dog went rigid. The German shepherd's ears flattened, his body stiffening like he was back on patrol in Fallujah. His eyes were locked on the stone fireplace, tail low, hackles raised. He didn't bark. He growled. A deep, guttural vibration, not from the throat, but from somewhere older, like it had come up through the floor. It made the air feel dense, like a storm was pressing in from all sides. The fire hadn't been lit yet. The hearth was cold, dark, and still smelled faintly of mildew and ash. But to Shadow, something was wrong. Cal sat frozen for a moment, pulse tightening in his neck. The wind outside moaned through the crooked eaves of the cabin. The boards creaked under the weight of snow that had fallen hard and fast all afternoon. He'd thought the place would be peaceful, quiet, remote, untouched. A place to breathe, heal, forget. He hadn't even unpacked fully. His rucksack sat by the door. A crowbar leaned against the far wall, still coated with orange price sticker residue from the local hardware store. The cabin itself was a skeleton of pine and stone, bought for $200 at a property tax auction no one else had even bid on. Some folks at the courthouse had looked away when he signed the papers. One woman had crossed herself. Cal hadn't cared. Until now. Shadow hadn't moved, still staring at the same spot, just above the base of the fireplace, just under the jagged edge of the mantel. His jaw was tight, breath slow, deliberate, controlled. He wasn't afraid. He was focused, like he used to be before they swept buildings together in southern Iraq. Cal stood slowly. His boots scuffed the dust-caked floor, and the sound felt too loud in the tiny room. He crouched beside the dog, laying a steadying hand on his back. Shadow's muscles trembled faintly under his palm. Alert, but not panicked. Watching, not reacting. That was always the difference with this dog. He never barked unless it mattered. The fireplace looked ordinary. Old stonework, soot-stained, a few loose bricks. But the air near it felt different, heavy, stale. Cal leaned in, brushed his fingers across the stones, cold to the touch. But when his hand reached the third stone on the bottom row, Shadow let out another growl. This one sharper, shorter. A warning. Cal flinched, instinct tightening his gut. All at once, he wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in the narrow alley near Karbala, standing behind a rusted door with wires poking out from beneath the sand. The same feeling, the same stillness in the air. Shadow had saved his life that day, freezing in place when Cal had been half a second from stepping on a buried trigger. He'd trusted the dog's instincts then. And now, standing in the chill of an unfamiliar cabin, he felt that same pull. "All right," Cal murmured, stepping back. He crossed the room and picked up the crowbar. The silence, stretched, only the wind and the occasional creak of settling timber. Shadow didn't move, not a step. He stayed planted like a statue, like a wall. Cal returned to the fireplace and, with slow, measured effort, began tapping the edge of the suspect stone. The first few hits echoed dully. Then, a hollow thump. He froze. Shadow's ears twitched. Again, thump. The difference was clear. Something was behind that stone. Cal set the crowbar into the thin seam of mortar. Teeth gritted. He pressed gently, then harder. The stone didn't budge. He repositioned, changed the angle, and drove the bar in deeper. The mortar cracked, not like old, crumbly dust, but like a seal snapping open. The stone shifted with a sound like a muffled breath being released. He set the crowbar aside and gripped the edges. It was heavy, dense. He braced his feet and pulled. A thin grind of rock on rock. Then the slab came free. Behind it, a dark hollow opened in the base of the fireplace. Rough-hewn, lined with dry stone. No dampness, no rot. Just air, cold and unmoving. Cal reached for his flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed the beam inside. At the bottom sat a small olive-green metal box. Military issue. Next to it, 3 leather-bound notebooks, bound with a brittle cord that snapped the moment Cal touched it. Shadow stepped closer now, his tail still low, but no longer curled tight. His gaze shifted from the hearth to the box. Cal set the journals aside, picked up the metal case, and laid it gently on the floor. It was heavier than expected. Solid. Cold. Familiar in the worst way, he didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he flipped open the first notebook. The pages were old, yellowed, but the handwriting was crisp. Neat. Block lettering in black ink. First few entries were benign, dates, weather patterns, notes on wildlife. Then came a line that made the hair on Cal's arms rise. They said the water was safe, but it made the deer foam at the mouth. Cal blinked. He turned another page. More notes, soil samples, unmarked barrels. Then the name. At the top of a fresh entry, E. Wren. He stared at it. That name. 20 years ago, Eli Wren, a freelance journalist, had gone missing while investigating environmental violations in the northern counties of Montana. His truck was found abandoned off a fire road, doors unlocked. No blood, no body, no answers. Locals had whispered for years. A bear attack, a blizzard, suicide. Cal looked down at the notebooks. This was Wren's handwriting. Shadow let out a soft whine. Not distressed, just alert. Cal didn't know what he'd expected when he bought the cabin. Peace, maybe. But now, kneeling on the cold floor, fingers brushing secrets no one wanted found, he realized what he had actually bought. Not a home, a grave. Shadow lay down beside him, silent but watching. Always watching. And Cal Rourke knew with sudden clarity he hadn't found this. Shadow had. The first snow fell heavy overnight, blanketing the cabin and the narrow trail leading up from the main road. Cal stood at the window just after dawn, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching thick flakes drift past the glass like slow-moving ash. The place was quieter than it should have been, too quiet for the creak of pine and the weight of the cold. Shadow sat at the threshold of the room, ears angled toward the fireplace again. He hadn't growled since the night before, but his body still held that same coiled tension. Not fear, not panic. Something else. Something closer to memory. Cal rubbed his hand over the back of his neck and exhaled. He wasn't used to silence without danger tucked behind it. He turned back toward the fire, now alive with a reluctant flame. Last night's discovery still sat at the edge of the room. The olive-green box and the cracked leather notebooks. He hadn't opened the box yet. Couldn't. Not with the weight of Shadow's gaze still fixed on the hearth like it might speak. Instead, Cal moved to the table, pulled a folded wool blanket from his pack, and sat beside the dog. "You remember Fallujah?" he asked softly, voice just above the crackle of the fire. Shadow didn't move, but his ear twitched. Cal stared into the flame for a long moment, fingers tightening around the mug. "I do." He remembered the smell first, dust and diesel, always hanging in the air like a warning. He remembered the noise, too, the endless rumble of generators, the metallic clang of gear against concrete, the distant thump of mortars that shook the walls of the forward operating base like thunder. But most of all, he remembered the day Shadow saved his life. It had been a routine patrol, if there was such a thing. Late afternoon, heat shimmering off broken pavement, the air thick enough to chew. Cal had been leading a 2-man team through a side alley off Market Road when Shadow froze. Not a sound, just a sudden halt. One paw raised, body motionless, ears forward. Cal knew what that meant. He stopped too, dropped to one knee. The others followed his lead without question. 20 seconds passed. 30. Then Cal saw it. Wires, barely visible, running beneath a flattened piece of corrugated steel just ahead. Pressure trigger, buried shallow. One more step, and it would have blown half the squad into the sky. Shadow had just sat down, quietly, as if to say, "This is where we stop." That night, Cal had patched a nasty gash along Shadow's foreleg from shattered glass. He hadn't flinched, hadn't moved, just sat there and let Cal work, eyes steady, breath calm. That was the day they stopped being soldier and dog. They became something else. Not brothers, not exactly, but bound. Cal reached down now and let his fingers brush through Shadow's coat. The dog leaned into it slightly, a low breath escaping his nose. The VA therapist had once called it mutual recovery. Said working dogs could help veterans manage the weight of memory, regulate sleep, ease hypervigilance. What she didn't say was how sometimes the dog became the only anchor left, the only thing keeping you from drifting too far out. Cal hadn't wanted to adopt him, not at first, but when he got discharged after the blast, the wall collapse, the shrapnel to the shoulder, he couldn't leave Shadow behind. He'd seen what happened to dogs who didn't get claimed after service. Not happening. So here they were, two ghosts in a cabin, trying to rebuild something from silence and snow. Cal stood and moved toward the fire. He added another log, watched it catch. The warmth did little to soften the unease in his chest. Not from fear, from something older, something unnamed. He glanced back at Shadow. The dog had moved, just slightly, closer to the fireplace again. "Seriously, bud," Cal muttered. "What do you smell?" Shadow didn't growl, but his gaze stayed fixed. He wasn't tense anymore, just vigilant, the way he used to be when patrolling a ridgeline, always half aware of what wasn't being said. Cal turned back towards the table. The notebooks were still there. He opened the second one. The entries picked up where the first had left off. Notes on terrain. Animal behavior. But then came something sharper. A list of well sites, dates. One entry simply read, "Third truck this week. No markings. Parked near Creekbed 4A. Left at 2:13 a.m. Below it, scribbled in slanted handwriting, "I think they know I'm watching." Cal swallowed hard. He heard a soft sound behind him. Shadow, shifting again. He walked to the window, pushed aside the curtain. Nothing but snow, trees, silence. But Shadow didn't leave the hearth. Cal closed the journal. The air felt tight again. He knew the signs. The way the hair on the back of his arms stood up. The way Shadow's body moved like it was reliving something it couldn't quite explain. This place wasn't haunted. Not in the way people meant. It was holding something. And Shadow was listening. Later, as the fire died to glowing embers, Cal stretched out his sleeping bag near the stone wall. Shadow curled up beside him, not touching, but close. Always close. He fell asleep not to dreams, but to breath. Deep, steady, dog breath, a rhythm that had become more familiar than his own. At some point in the night, he woke cold. The wind outside had picked up. Snow lashed against the windows like nails. Shadow was sitting up, not alert, but watching the door. Not the hearth this time. The door. Cal sat up slowly. He didn't hear anything. But Shadow's ears flicked. Outside, somewhere beyond the line of trees, a branch cracked. Not from wind, weight, movement. Then silence. Cal held his breath. Shadow didn't growl, but he didn't lie down either. And Cal knew something out there was watching too. And it had been for a while. It began with a sound Cal hadn't heard in years. Scraping. Deliberate. Rhythmic. Sharp enough to wake him from a light doze before dawn. Shadow was digging. Not outside. Not in the snow. Inside. At the base of the fireplace. Cal bolted upright from his sleeping bag, heartbeat kicking. The fire had burned low, casting a faint orange pulse along the cabin walls. Shadow's form moved in and out of that glow, powerful shoulders shifting as his front paws scraped steadily at the stone hearth. Claws against mortar. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't anxious. It was surgical. "Shadow," Cal said, voice gravel rough. "What are you doing?" Shadow paused just long enough to glance back, eyes catching the ember light. Then he turned and dug harder. Cal got to his feet, pulling on his flannel shirt. The cold bit at his legs through worn sweatpants. He crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt beside the dog. Dust was rising now, curling into the air like old breath. "What the hell?" Cal reached out and brushed his hand across the spot Shadow had been working on. At first, it looked the same as the rest of the hearth, cracked grey mortar between uneven stones. But then he saw it. A faint line. Clean. Too clean. A rectangular outline around a single slab. The mortar wasn't crumbly here. It was darker, smoother. It had been sealed. Cal rose slowly and retrieved the crowbar, leaning in the corner. He returned, gave Shadow a nod. The dog stepped aside, posture tense but patient, like he was waiting for Cal to do his part. The first press of metal into the seam didn't give. The second did. With a crack like snapping bone, the seal fractured. Shadow didn't move. Cal adjusted the angle, wedged the bar deeper, and leaned in with his full weight. The stone shifted. Once, twice, then gave way with a grinding groan. He lifted it with both hands, muscles straining, heart thudding in his ears. The slab slid free, landing on the floor beside him with a hollow thud. Beneath it, a cavity, 3 feet deep, rough stone walls, dry as a tomb. Inside sat a dark green military box, edges worn, paint faded, corners rusted. Next to it lay a stack of leather-bound notebooks, tied together with a string so old it fell apart as Cal touched it. He stared for a moment, breath caught halfway to his lungs. Then he reached in and lifted both items out, setting them gently on the nearby table. Shadow remained near the hearth, eyes fixed on the empty hole like something might crawl back out of it. Cal sat down, wiped the dust from his hands, and opened the top notebook. The first page read, in careful block print, E. Wren, May 14th. Cal froze. Eli Wren. The name was familiar. He'd heard it once, maybe twice, during his first week in town. Old story. A freelance journalist who went missing up in the mountains 2 decades ago. Showed up asking too many questions about land surveys and water tables. His truck was found empty. Keys still in the ignition. No sign of foul play, but he'd never been seen again. Locals had stopped talking about it. Cal turned the page. The entries started harmless enough. Wildlife sightings, weather notes, descriptions of the valley's geography. But even in those first few pages, something felt off. Too precise. Too watchful. June 2nd. 2 men parked near Creek Bend, no markings, returned after dark, dug for 2 hours, left nothing behind. June 14th. Water near wellhead smells metallic again. Animals avoiding the area. 2nd dead fox this week. July 3rd. Received anonymous letter at door. No return address. It said, "You're not welcome here." Burned it. Kept ashes. Cal read faster. The writing changed over time, grew tighter. Ink pressed harder into the page. The margins filled with shorthand codes, symbols, a man unraveling or discovering something too big for a notebook. Then this. July 29th. Sheriff came by. Said I should ease up on the paranoia. But I saw him talking to the men by the ridge. I'm not imagining this. Cal closed the journal. His skin prickled. He looked at the box. Still unopened. He flipped the latch, lifted the lid. Inside were vials, samples, soil, water, all labeled in careful handwriting, dates and locations. One zippered pouch held what looked like lab reports. Cal pulled one out. Geochemical analysis. Sample number 1172 contaminants. Detected. Arsenic, benzene, mercury, toluene, notes, levels exceed EPA safe thresholds by factor of 12. He blinked. Shadow let out a low sound, not quite a growl, just presence. Cal looked at him. "You found this," he whispered. Shadow's eyes stayed fixed on the fireplace. He hadn't relaxed. Not really. Cal reached into the box again, pulled out a folded paper tucked between the reports. A hand-drawn map, the valley, the ridgeline, several red circles marked across it, dated, and a word scrawled at the bottom corner, Terra Vex. That name he didn't recognize, but he would. He stood, heart pounding, and looked back at the hearth. It was just cold stone, but now it felt like something more, like a locked room that had just been opened, and whatever had been buried there. It wasn't done yet. The snow had slowed by mid-morning, but the cold had teeth. Cal stood outside the cabin, steam rising from the mug in his hands, watching the frozen woods beyond the tree line. Shadow sat next to him, alert, but calm, scanning the perimeter with the quiet intensity of a soldier on overwatch. His ears twitched once, then again. Then Cal heard it too. Tires on packed snow. Slow, cautious. A few seconds later, the sound of an engine idling just beyond the bend. A county-issued SUV came into view, mud-caked, grey, government plate. The vehicle pulled to a stop at the base of the small hill. The door creaked open. Out stepped a man in a brown sheriff's jacket, gold star gleaming on his chest. Big, square-shouldered, probably in his late 50s. His mustache was the kind that had seen years of small-town politics and knew how to smile without meaning it. "Sheriff Gregson," he called, casual as a neighbor checking on a borrowed chainsaw. "Beautiful morning, huh?" Cal said nothing at first. He just watched him. Shadow didn't bark. But he stood up, slowly, shoulders squared, body still. The sheriff noticed. His eyes dipped to the dog, then flicked back to Cal. "Didn't mean to spook anyone. Just figured I'd stop by. Heard someone finally took 9B off the county's hands." 12B, Cal replied flatly. $200. "Right, hell of a deal. If you don't mind the draft and creaky floors." The man took a few steps closer, hands in his jacket pockets, glancing around like he was inspecting a barn for termites. "I grew up not far from here. Used to fish just past that ridge." Shadow moved between them, positioning himself half a step ahead of Cal. Gregson noticed. "He yours?" Cal nodded once. "Name's Shadow. Retired military." "Figured as much." The sheriff offered a slight chuckle. "He doesn't wag much, does he?" "He doesn't need to." Gregson's smile faltered just a touch. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Not exactly. But it shifted, turned dense in the space between them. The kind of silence where too much understanding lives. "Just checking in," the sheriff said after a beat. "Folks around here tend to be, well, curious when strangers show up, especially in the dead of winter. You planning to stay long?" Cal took a sip of coffee. "Long as it takes." The sheriff tilted his head. "Take for what?" Cal didn't answer. Neither did Shadow. The wind picked up, rustling the trees behind them. Gregson glanced past Cal's shoulder toward the cabin. "Got the fire going in there?" "Trying." "Good, it gets real cold at night, especially out here. Isolated." Another pause. Shadow's body shifted. He didn't growl, not yet, but the hair along his spine began to rise. His head was low, eyes locked on the man in front of him. Calculating. Gregson finally took the hint and took a step back. "Well," he said, voice lighter than his eyes, "I'll leave you to it, but if anything comes up, pipes freeze, generator goes out, whatever, you know where to find me." "I'll manage." Gregson paused. Then, with the same tight smile, he added, "And if you stumble on anything strange, old bones, old stories, Whatever's buried in this place, best to leave it where it is. That smile stayed in place, but his eyes had turned. No threat, just certainty, like he was reminding Cal of a rule he wasn't supposed to forget. Shadow finally growled. Deep, controlled. Enough to vibrate through the soles of Cal's boots. Gregson nodded once, not startled. I see he's got good instincts. Cal didn't say a word. The sheriff turned and walked back toward his SUV. Slow steps, no rush. When he drove off, his tires didn't spin, didn't rush to gain traction. He wasn't running. He was finished. For now. Cal stayed still until the taillights disappeared into the woods. Then he looked down at Shadow. The dog had already turned back towards the cabin, ears still back, tail low and steady. No bark, no need. Inside, the fire had burned low. Cal added wood, watched the flame catch, then sat back on the edge of the chair near the hearth. The stone slab he'd pulled up yesterday was still off to the side, cold and streaked with dust. The military box sat in its place under the table, untouched since the discovery. He picked up the second notebook. Wren's handwriting again. Cal read through 3 pages, then stopped at a single line, centered at the top. They came to warn me. The badge always smiles before it bites. Cal shut the book. So Wren had spoken to Gregson, too. And that smile, Cal had seen it just minutes ago. A small-town nicety stretched over rot. He looked at Shadow. The dog hadn't moved far. He sat by the front door now, watching the outside like it might shift at any second. Cal felt it too. That cabin wasn't just old, it was staged. It had been waiting for someone like him. And someone else knew it. The night was still, the kind of still that came before something broke. Cal sat hunched over the table, the notebook spread open beneath the weak glow of a single oil lamp. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, whispering through the cracks of the old logs. Inside, the fire was dying, its last embers flickering red across the room. Shadow lay nearby, chin on his paws, eyes fixed on the door. The pages before Cal were a mess of ink, numbers and dates. But buried within the chaos, a story had begun to take shape, one that made his stomach twist. Terravex Industries. The name appeared again and again, in Wren's tight, deliberate handwriting. Beside it, chemical codes, shipment routes, lab coordinates. The kind of details that weren't meant for public eyes. Wren had connected something. Illegal dumping, falsified environmental reports, local politicians paid off to look the other way. The water tests, the poisoned soil, the missing witnesses. It all pointed here, to this valley. Cal rubbed his temples, staring at the final page. The last line was written in a shaky scrawl. They'll burn it before they let it be found. He sat back in the chair, feeling the weight of the words settle. That was what Wren had died for. And that was why no one else had touched this cabin since. Shadow's ears twitched. A low, breathy rumble started deep in his chest. Cal froze. What is it? The dog was on his feet now, muscles tight, body angled toward the back door. His tail went rigid, and his head lowered. Another sound followed, the faint crunch of snow. Slow, measured. Cal reached for his rifle leaning against the wall. The cabin felt suddenly too small, too fragile. He moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. Through the thin frost on the glass, he caught a flicker of movement in the trees. A silhouette. Then another. 2 figures. Maybe 3. Moving low. Easy, he whispered, glancing down. Shadow was already at the window, breath fogging the glass. No bark, no growl now, just waiting. Cal clicked off the lamp, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The only light came from the embers in the hearth, painting faint orange across Shadow's fur. He crouched low and motioned toward the back wall. They'd trained for this once, years ago. Different war, different reason. The instincts were still there, his and the dog's. A soft metallic tap broke the silence. The back doorknob. Turning. Shadow stiffened. Cal raised the rifle, sighting down the hallway. The latch gave a quiet click. The door eased open an inch, then another. That was all Shadow needed. The dog lunged, a streak of muscle and instinct, slamming into the door with a crash. A shout followed, raw and startled. The intruder stumbled backward, hitting the snow with a grunt. Cal moved to the frame, rifle raised. "Don't move!" The man on the ground was masked, dressed in dark tactical clothing. Not a drifter, not a hunter. A professional. He rolled, reaching for his side. Cal's finger tensed on the trigger, too late. The man swung a short barrel towards him. The flash lit the night white. The bullet tore through the doorframe inches from Cal's shoulder. He dropped, hit the floor hard, and rolled for cover behind the table. The next shot shattered the lamp. Glass rained down. Shadow launched again, bursting through the open doorway. His body hit the man mid-rise, jaws clamping around the attacker's arm. The gun went off once more, the round ripping into the air above them. The man screamed, thrashing, trying to shake the dog loose. Shadow's grip tightened. He dragged the intruder sideways into the snow, snarling now, raw, controlled, unrelenting. Cal came up from behind the table, rifle steady. "Stop!" The masked man froze. Shadow's teeth were still locked on his forearm, blood dark against the snow. Cal stepped closer, the barrel of his weapon inches from the man's head. "Who sent you?" The intruder didn't answer. His eyes flicked past Cal's shoulder toward the cabin, and then, with a voice tight and trembling, he said, "They're coming. Burn it down." He twisted, drove his knee into Shadow's ribs, and broke free. Cal fired, but the man was already moving, sprinting into the tree line. The shot hit bark and vanished into the night. The forest swallowed him whole. Cal lowered the rifle, breathing hard. The cold air burned his throat. Shadow limped back to him, chest heaving, blood smeared across his muzzle. Cal dropped to one knee, hands shaking as he checked him over. "You all right, boy?" Shadow licked his hand once, eyes still locked on the darkness beyond the door. He was trembling, but not from pain, from readiness, from instinct. Cal looked up, out into the woods. Nothing but black and white. No sound, no light, just the hollow quiet of a place holding its breath. He turned back inside, grabbed the box from under the table, and dumped the notebooks into his pack. He hesitated for only a second before grabbing the crowbar and hammering the damaged door shut. They weren't safe anymore. He moved to the window again, scanning the tree line. Somewhere out there, someone had tried to silence the truth Wren had uncovered. And now they knew Cal had found it. Shadow pressed against his leg, head low, ears angled towards the forest. Cal rested a hand on his neck, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath. "Not yet," he whispered. "They'll try again, but not tonight." The wind howled through the cracks, carrying the scent of gunpowder and snow. The fire hissed and went out. In the dark, only two steady sounds remained: Cal's heartbeat and the quiet rhythm of Shadow's breathing. The war they thought they'd left behind had just found its way back. Cal worked fast, his fingers stiff with cold but steady from years of field experience. The military-issue sat phone lay open on the table, its antenna extended toward the window where the signal was strongest. Next to it, the small field scanner buzzed quietly, its green LED flickering each time a page was processed. He'd scanned nearly everything: Wren's journals, the soil reports, the water sample logs, even the hand-drawn map covered in red circles and cryptic annotations. Each file was zipped and encrypted using software he hadn't touched since Kandahar. Across the room, Shadow lay on his side, eyes half-lidded, breathing steady but shallow. The bandage on his rib, hastily wrapped after the previous night's fight, was soaked through with blood and melted snow. But he didn't whimper. He didn't move. "Almost there, bud," Cal murmured, not knowing if the words were for the dog or for himself. He opened his contact list. Only 2 names were saved. One was crossed out. The other, Riley Tran. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Last Cal heard, Riley was working as an investigative journalist out of D.C., writing for a paper that still published truth like it mattered. They'd served together during their second deployment, back when both believed the job was to defend something. Cal had left with a shattered shoulder and a memory full of noise. Riley had left with a camera and a mission. Cal typed a brief message into the sat phone. "Need your eyes. Files attached. Trust no one. Will call in 60. Rourke, he hit send. The signal bar blinked. Searching, then delivered. Cal exhaled, grabbed the hard case of water samples, and placed it beside the now full satchel. Every vial had been photographed. Every document tagged. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to crack open whatever Terra Vex had buried here. He looked at Shadow. The dog's gaze hadn't left him. "You stay down. I'll handle the rest." Outside, the night had gone silent again, the kind of silence that felt intentional. Cal crossed to the window, lifted the curtain a half-inch. Movement, just past the tree line. A flicker of orange. Then gone. He turned. "Shadow!" Before he could finish, glass exploded inward. A bottle sailed through the front window and hit the floor in a burst of flame. The Molotov ignited instantly, the fire licking across the wooden boards like it had been waiting. The second hit the far wall. Curtains flared. Heat surged. Shadow was already up, limping, but charging toward the door. He turned sharply, barking once, a sharp cutting sound, the first since Fallujah. Cal grabbed the satchel, slung it over his shoulder, and dove for the back door. Another bottle shattered. The cabin groaned as fire crawled up the walls. "Shadow! Out!" But the dog wasn't there. Smoke rolled in. The air turned black. Cal dropped low, coughing, eyes burning. He could hear the flames chewing through timber. The front half of the cabin was gone. Roof cracking. The scanner on the table burst into sparks. Then, through the haze, a shape, a flash of fur and muscle. Shadow barreled back in, teeth clamped around Cal's sleeve, dragging him toward the rear. "Go! Go!" Cal stumbled after him. He kicked open the back door with his boot. The cold hit like a wave of clarity. He fell into the snow face first, coughing violently. Shadow lunged through the doorway behind him. Then the roof collapsed. The heat behind them bloomed, a searing roar that lit the snow like daylight. Cal rolled onto his back, still clutching the satchel, gasping for air. He reached for Shadow. The dog staggered, his left side scorched, fur singed to the skin. He dropped to the snow, panting, but didn't cry out. "Jesus!" Cal breathed. "No, no, no." He tore off his jacket, pressed it to the worst of the burns. Shadow's muscles flinched under the contact, but he didn't pull away. He just looked at Cal, eyes calm, resolute. "You stupid, brave son of a... You came back in!" Shadow blinked, slow. He rested his head against Cal's knee. The sat phone buzzed once. Incoming message, receiving. Files opened. "I got them. You okay?" Riley Cal stared at the screen, heart hammering. They got out. The evidence was out. He looked at Shadow again. The dog's breathing was uneven now, shallow. "You saved it," Cal said, voice cracking. "You saved everything." He didn't need a response. Shadow's eyes were still open, still alert. Even burned, even broken, he was guarding. Guarding Cal. Guarding the truth. And somewhere behind them, in the blaze that once was their shelter, all the lies Terra Vex had tried to bury were turning to ash. But it didn't matter, because Shadow had carried them through. Again. They moved through the trees like shadows themselves, leaving barely a trace in the snow behind them. Cal kept low, his breath turning to fog in the frigid air. The satchel was still strapped to his chest, tight against his body, and every few steps he glanced over his shoulder, not just to check for pursuers, but to make sure Shadow was still behind him. The dog limped through the powder, each step heavy, labored. His left flank was charred raw beneath the bandage, his side rising and falling in quick, shallow rhythm. But he didn't stop. Not once. Not even when Cal paused to let him rest. They reached the low ridge just after midnight. It wasn't much, just a shelf of granite tucked beneath a thick curtain of pine. But it offered shelter from the wind and cover from any eyes in the woods. Cal dropped to one knee and brushed snow aside to make a space. Then he turned back and gently called, "Here, boy." Shadow came without hesitation, his body trembling as he lowered himself next to Cal. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest was quiet, but not peaceful. The kind of quiet that held memory. The kind of quiet that sounded too much like waiting. Cal unzipped the med kit with fingers stiff from cold. He had used this same kit in Afghanistan, patched gunshot wounds and shrapnel tears under the blast of rotor blades and mortar fire, but never had his hands shaken like this. "All right, let's get you fixed up," he said softly, voice more breath than sound. Shadow didn't flinch when Cal peeled the old bandage away. The skin beneath was angry, blistered. The fur was burned clean off in a hand-sized patch. Cal cleaned the wound as best he could, working quickly, his breath hitching when Shadow exhaled hard through his nose, but didn't pull away. "You remember that alley in Kabbalah?" Cal whispered, half to himself. "You froze right in front of me, one paw up, ears stiff. I almost yelled at you to move, and then—" His hands paused. "You wouldn't. You just sat, calm as anything, and I looked down and saw the pressure plate." He shook his head, blinking the memory away. "I'd have stepped right on it. Would have taken both of us out." Shadow shifted slightly, leaning into Cal's knee. "You didn't bark then either. You just knew." Cal sat back on his heels, pressing the fresh gauze into place, taping it tight. "And now here we are again. You dragged me out of that fire before I even realized we were surrounded." He looked at the dog's face. Shadow's eyes were open, sharp despite the pain. He wasn't just enduring this, he was present, watching, waiting. "You saw it coming, didn't you?" Cal said. "You knew it wasn't over." A gust of wind cut through the trees, rattling the branches overhead. Snow dropped in clumps. Cal looked up instinctively, scanning the tree line. They were safe, for now, but safety felt like a borrowed thing. He reached for the sat phone, powered it on. A weak signal pulsed in the upper corner of the screen. No messages, no incoming threats. But they couldn't go back, not to the cabin, not to town. Whoever had lit that fire had meant to erase everything. And if they had gotten even one step closer, Cal wouldn't be breathing. The files would have turned to ash. Shadow would be gone. The silence deepened, thick as fog. Cal sat, against the stone wall of the ridge, pulling the blanket from his pack. He wrapped it around Shadow's body first, then around himself. The warmth helped, a little. The firelight back in the cabin was still imprinted on his vision. The way it danced up the walls, the way it devoured Wren's notebooks, his scanner, their shelter. All of it had burned. But not the truth, because Shadow had saved it. Cal stared out into the night. Snow fell again, soft and soundless. And for the first time he understood something. This wasn't just about evidence, or pollution, or even justice. This was about erasure. Someone wanted this land clean of memory, of ghosts, of anything that whispered what had really happened. But ghosts didn't burn that easily. Not when a soldier and his dog were still standing. Not when the ghosts were guarding them. Shadow stirred beside him, his body warm against Cal's side. Cal looked down and murmured, "You didn't let them take it." The dog blinked once, slow and calm. "You didn't let them take me." For a long time, they sat in silence under the trees, listening. The storm passed. The fire had burned. But they were still here. And the ghosts? They were watching too. The first helicopter came just after dawn, low and fast over the tree line, shattering the morning silence with a wash of rotor thunder. Cal shot upright, instantly awake. His body ached from the cold, the uneven ground, the hours of tension, but his instincts were sharp. He reached for the sat phone beside him, already vibrating against the frozen dirt. One message flashed on the screen. "They're coming in. Stay low. You did it." RT. He didn't smile. Not yet. From their hidden ridge, Cal could see the valley floor through a break in the trees. The fire had finally burned itself out. What was left of the cabin smoldered in a skeletal ruin, a black mark against the snow. But now, things were moving. 3 black SUVs were crawling up the trail. The chopper had circled back and was descending near the clearing, kicking up a cyclone of ash and snow. Shadow stirred beside him, still bandaged, still sore, but alert. His ears flicked toward the sound. He didn't rise. He didn't bark. He just watched. Cal placed a hand gently on the dog's shoulder. "This is it," he said quietly. 2 more helicopters followed. One bore the insignia of the Department of Justice. The other, EPA Special Investigations Unit. Within minutes, agents were fanning out across the site. They moved with purpose. Tactical teams first, sweeping, securing. Then suits. EPA field specialists with heavy packs, equipment cases, sample kits. Cal spotted hazmat gear being pulled from storage bins. He stayed hidden a little longer, not because he feared them, but because he knew the moment he stepped out, everything would change. He looked at Shadow. The dog met his gaze. Then, with a soft grunt of effort, stood up. He was limping, but steady. Cal gave a small nod. "Let's finish this." They descended through the snow, slow and visible, hands out. A female agent saw them first. She lifted a hand, signaling the others. Within seconds, weapons lowered. Radios buzzed. "Cal Rourke," she called, walking toward them. Cal stopped 10 feet away. "Yeah." She pulled off her gloves, offered her hand. "Agent Ramirez, DOJ. We've been expecting you." Behind her, more vehicles rolled in. Another SUV stopped near the tree line. Out stepped a familiar figure. Tall, dark jacket, scarf half-tied, wind slicing through his grey-streaked hair. Riley Tran. He moved fast, not bothering with introductions. He clapped Cal on the shoulder, then dropped to one knee beside Shadow. "Jesus," Riley murmured. "You really walked through fire, huh, boy?" Shadow looked him over, then, just once, leaned his head forward until it brushed Riley's chest. That was enough. Cal turned to Ramirez. "Did it stick?" She nodded. "Your files matched intel we've been gathering for months but couldn't verify. The map, the water samples, Wren's journals. You gave us the backbone." "And Gregson?" Cal asked. Ramirez glanced over her shoulder. A separate team had split off, blocking the road leading back to town. One of the SUVs had turned away from the others and was parked at an angle. The rear doors were open. Sheriff Gregson stood there, cuffed, flanked by 2 agents. His expression wasn't surprised. Cal locked eyes with him across the distance. Gregson didn't speak. He didn't struggle. But his jaw clenched, as if chewing on the end of a secret he'd never get to swallow. Shadow stood beside Cal, quiet, still, gaze fixed. No bark, no growl. Just that same unwavering focus he'd shown in the field. The same stillness he used when danger was passing but not yet gone. He was watching the end of something. Gregson looked back at the dog, and for the first time, Cal saw a flicker of something close to fear in the man's eyes. Not fear of jail, fear of being seen for what he was, a coward behind a badge. Corruption, bribery, environmental destruction, Ramirez said, her voice low. The indictment will be the size of a novel. Terravex is unraveling as we speak. Top brass are already lawyering up. Ren? Cal asked. Ramirez's face softened. We found the well site he marked on the map. The soil was disturbed. Preliminary forensics say it's a human burial. Too soon to confirm, but... Cal looked away, jaw tight. I think he knew this place would bury him, he said quietly. But he left the truth anyway. A gust of wind kicked ash into the air. The remnants of the cabin creaked under the weight of silence. Reporters had begun to arrive, their vans lining the road beyond the tree line. Cameras would follow. Stories would be told. But not the whole story. Only Shadow had lived it all, start to finish. As more agents poured in, Riley leaned closer and said, They want a press. Photo. You and the dog. Maybe by the wreckage. Cal glanced at Shadow, then shook his head. He didn't do it for the press. Then do it for Ren. A pause. Then Cal said, Fine, but he stands where he wants. They posed near the edge of the blackened foundation, just far enough from the twisted ruins. Shadow stood with Cal, not touching, not wagging his tail. Just steady. As if he understood this wasn't victory. It was acknowledgement. The camera shutters clicked, dozens of them. But none captured what Cal saw when he looked down at the dog. Loyalty, pain, wisdom, and the kind of peace that came only when a mission had been completed. Ramirez approached again, softer now. You two did more than anyone with a badge ever managed to. Cal didn't respond. He was still watching the trees. Shadow sat down beside him, and finally, for the first time in days, exhaled. The press conference was held in the town's courthouse, but they'd cleared the benches to make room for cameras. It looked more like a war tribunal than a civic announcement. Cal didn't want to be there. Not under the lights, not behind a podium, not surrounded by people who hadn't believed a word he said just days before. He hadn't shaved. He wore an old grey Henley, boots still caked with ash, jeans that hadn't been washed since before the fire. And yet, somehow, he was the most grounded man in the room. Shadow stood beside him, not leashed, not commanded, just there. He hadn't left Cal's side since the cabin burned. The place was packed, local reporters, national outlets, even EPA's regional director. Sheriff Gregson had been flown out under heavy security the night before, and Terravex's board had just been indicted for conspiracy and environmental crimes. Every seat was taken. The air smelled like coffee and nerves. Riley had offered to speak first, but Cal had declined. They don't need a federal agent, he'd said. They need the truth. He stepped up to the microphone. No script, no badge, just the raw voice of a man who had walked through something and come out carrying more than he started with. His throat was dry, but he didn't clear it. He just started. I'm not a hero, he said. Silence. I didn't uncover a conspiracy. I didn't solve anything. I didn't outsmart anyone. He glanced down at Shadow, who was sitting quietly now, ears relaxed, but eyes tracking every shift in the room. I just followed my dog. A murmur rippled through the audience, then vanished. Cal's voice steadied. I was broken when I came back to this place. I'd buried my son. I had nothing left but a cabin and a ghost. I didn't come looking for justice. Hell, I didn't even come looking for answers. He paused, let that sink in. But he did. He nodded toward Shadow. The cameras pivoted to catch him. A soft metallic whir of focus lenses. He started digging before I did. He pulled at roots, pawed at boards, chased scents I couldn't smell. And every time I tried to quit, he didn't. A few people looked down, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward. I didn't know what he was chasing until it was too late, until we found the fire, and the bones, and the lies. He breathed in slowly, as if the air in the room had weight. He didn't bark when they cuffed the sheriff. He didn't run when the flames closed in. He didn't hesitate, not once. A beat. So no, I didn't uncover the truth. I just listened to the only living soul that hadn't lied to me. His hand dropped to Shadow's back. And he hasn't been wrong. Not once. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved, not even the camera crews. Then, without a word, Shadow rose. He stepped forward, not toward the lights, not toward the press, but toward the edge of the stage. He sat. Tall, still, quiet. A soldier at rest. You could hear the air conditioning kick on. That's how quiet the room had become. From the front row, a young girl's voice whispered, "That's the dog from the fire." No one shushed her, because now everyone could see it. This wasn't just a dog. This wasn't a mascot or a pet or a tool. This was a witness, a survivor, a partner. Cal didn't speak again. He didn't need to. One of the reporters tried to ask a question, something about awards, about whether the Pentagon was going to give Shadow a commendation or a medal. But Cal had already stepped down. He didn't walk to the exit. He walked toward Shadow. The dog stood, met him halfway, and in front of every lens in that room, Cal knelt, not in reverence, but in recognition. "Let's go home, buddy." As they turned to leave, Agent Ramirez stepped forward with a folder. "You might want to see this," she whispered. Cal opened it halfway. Inside were photos, from a federal site in Nevada. A grave, unmarked but fresh. "Ren?" he asked. Ramirez nodded. Dental confirmed. He didn't die in the fire. Terravex moved him. Cal exhaled. He would bury Ren the right way. The stage behind them faded into noise, reporters breaking down, microphones being packed up, officials shaking hands. But the moment had already passed. And in its silence, something else took root. A realization that maybe the ones who couldn't speak could still be heard. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. Shadow lifted his nose to it, breathed deep, and walked forward without hesitation. The kind of walk that said, "The mission isn't over. Not yet." The rebuilt cabin stood humbly against the wind. It wasn't polished. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to impress. It was solid. Cedar frame, stone hearth, tin roof that hummed when it rained. Cal had rebuilt it himself, over long weeks of quiet labor, each nail driven with a memory. No contractors, no blueprints, just hands that remembered how to build a home out of the ashes of a battlefield. The front porch still creaked. He kept it that way. Shadow lay. There most afternoons, paws stretched long over the wood, chest rising slow, eyes half closed but never fully at rest. He no longer growled at every passing wind. The fire inside him had cooled, but not burned out. He was older now. They both were. But they were still here, and they were still guarding. The town kept its respectful distance. Every once in a while, someone from the sheriff's office would drop by with updates on the trial. Terravex executives were flipping on each other. The scandal was national news for a month before the next crisis shoved it aside. But the mountain remembered. The trail behind the cabin had been named in Shadow's honor, K9 Ridge. A plaque nailed to an old pine marked the spot where he had first dug up the truth. Cal didn't attend the ceremony. He was never one for applause. But he kept the photo. Someone had snapped it. Cal standing next to Shadow at the press conference, hand on the dog's back, the two of them silhouetted in front of a rising sun through the courthouse windows. It hung on the wall now, right next to an older one, a photo from overseas, dust and heat and fatigue soaked into the edges. Cal, 20 pounds lighter, flak jacket stained with the weight of too many days. Shadow by his side, lean and alert, nose just inches from a desert road littered with wires. They were soldiers then. They still were. Beneath the photo, burned into a slab of dark pine, was a single line of text. Some truths bark before they speak. One crisp morning, Cal heard footsteps on the gravel. Not cautious ones, young, eager. He didn't reach for the shotgun this time. A teenager came into view, skinny, maybe 17, notebook in hand, wearing a college hoodie that hung off one shoulder. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward when Shadow didn't move. "You Mr. Callahan?" Cal nodded. "I'm doing a project for school, history class. They told us to write about truth, about how sometimes it's not in textbooks. I thought maybe I could ask you a few questions." Cal didn't answer at first, just looked the boy over, then nodded towards the porch. "You ask. I'll answer if I got the words." The kid sat, nervously at first, then more comfortably when Shadow rested his head on the teen's boot. For the next hour they talked. About Wren, about fire, about silence, about war. The boy scribbled furiously, eyes wide, but respectful. Then, just before he packed up, he looked at Cal and said softly, "You didn't just survive, sir. You held on to something they tried to burn down." Cal blinked, didn't speak, didn't need to. Shadow let out a low exhale and nudged the boy's knee once. The message was clear. The boy stood, nodded a quiet goodbye, and walked back down the gravel trail. Cal stayed on the porch until dusk. As light began to fade, he glanced at the old photograph again. The war hadn't ended in Iraq. It had just moved underground into politics and pipelines and lies dressed in corporate logos. But truth? Truth still had 4 legs, a scar across his muzzle, and a stare that cut through the noise. That night, Cal poured a whiskey and stepped out onto the porch. Shadow followed, laying down without a word. The stars blinked on. No wind, just the sound of the pines rustling somewhere beyond. He raised his glass slightly. "To the ones who can't speak, and the ones who won't lie." Shadow didn't move, but his ear twitched. Message received. And if you're still reading, still listening, maybe you've known a dog like that. Maybe you've had one who stayed beside you when the rest of the world turned its back. Maybe you still do. So tell us, what's your story with a loyal pet? Because here, in this cabin rebuilt from ruin, in this quiet place guarded by something ancient and fierce, we're still listening, still here, still guarding. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe dogs like Shadow deserve to be remembered, then support our channel, German Shepherd. Because some truths don't die. They wait until someone is brave enough to follow the bark.